Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The morning Caleb Moore walked into the Ravenport Community Center, nobody expected him to say what he did. He was 73 years old, silver-haired, with hands that still trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup. The local historical society had invited him to talk about his 40 years working for the rail company, expecting stories about steam engines and changing technology. Instead, Caleb stood at the podium, cleared his throat, and said something that would haunt everyone in that room. "I killed a man once," he began. "Or maybe I saved 5 people. I still don't know which one is true." The room went silent. Caleb's voice was steady, but his eyes were somewhere else, somewhere decades in the past. He described a summer afternoon in 1982, the kind of day where the heat shimmered off the tracks and made everything look like it was underwater. He had been working the switching station at the old Ravenport freight yard when the call came through. A runaway train, brakes failed, heading straight toward a section where a maintenance crew was working. 5 men. No time to warn them. No time for them to move. Caleb had looked at his panel. There was a switch. He could redirect the train to a side track. But on that side track, there was another worker, a man named Thomas Brennan, doing routine inspection work. Caleb had maybe 15 seconds to decide. He could do nothing and let the train hit the 5 men. Or he could pull the switch and send the train toward Thomas Brennan instead. "I pulled the switch," Caleb said, his voice cracking slightly. The train went down the side track. Thomas died instantly. The other 5 men lived. They got married, had children, retired. Thomas never got any of that. He paused, looking out at the audience. "People told me I did the right thing. 5 lives for 1 life," they said. Simple math. But I see Thomas sometimes, in my dreams, and he asks me a question I can never answer. He asks me who gave me the right to choose. Caleb sat down. Nobody applauded. The moderator fumbled for something to say, but Caleb was already leaving, walking slowly toward the door, carrying that question with him like he had carried it for 42 years. 300 miles away, in a university lecture hall at North Shore Civic Institute, Dr. Elias Rowan was preparing for his most controversial class of the semester. He was known for this. Students called his course the ethics nightmare behind his back, though always with a strange mixture of dread and fascination. Rowan was in his mid-50s, thin and intense, with the kind of eyes that seemed to see straight through comfortable lies. He didn't believe in teaching ethics through theory. He believed in stories. He believed in forcing people to confront the moment when their moral certainty collapsed. The students filtered in, filling the tiered seats. There were about 60 of them, mostly juniors and seniors, from philosophy majors to pre-law students to engineers who needed an ethics credit. They settled into their seats with the casual confidence of people who believed they knew the difference between right and wrong. Rowan began without preamble. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said. "I won't explain it. I won't add context. I just want you to vote. Don't think too hard. Trust your instinct." He projected an image on the screen behind him. A simple diagram. A train track splitting into 2 paths. "A train is heading toward 5 people," he said. "They're tied to the tracks. They can't move. The train will kill all 5 of them. You're standing at a switch. If you pull it, the train will change tracks. But on that other track, there's 1 person also tied down. If you pull the switch, that person dies instead. What do you do?" Hands shot up immediately. Rowan counted. 52 students said they would pull the switch. 8 said they wouldn't. "Interesting," Rowan said, his face expressionless. "Most of you chose to kill 1 person to save 5. That's utilitarianism. Outcome-based thinking. The greatest good for the greatest number." He let that sink in. Hold on to that certainty. Remember exactly how sure you felt just now. Write it down if you need to. A student in the front row, a young woman named Jessica, raised her hand. "It's obvious though, right? 5 lives are worth more than 1 life." Rowan smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Is it obvious? Let me ask you this. Do you believe 5 old people are worth more than 1 child? 5 criminals worth more than 1 innocent person? 5 strangers worth more than your mother?" Jessica hesitated. "That's different. Is it?" Rowan didn't wait for an answer. "Let's try another scenario. Same numbers. Different story." He changed the slide. This time it showed a bridge overlooking train tracks. 5 people are tied to the tracks, he said. A train is coming. It will kill all 5. You're standing on a bridge above the tracks. Next to you is a very large man. If you push him off the bridge, his body will stop the train. The 5 people will live. The large man will die. Same outcome. 5 live, 1 dies. Do you push him? This time, the room went quiet. A few hands went up hesitantly. Rowan counted. 7 people said they would push the man. 53 said they wouldn't. Fascinating, Rowan said softly. Same math. 5 for 1. But everything changed, didn't it? And here's what I want you to understand. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm not going to explain the difference. I want you to sit with that contradiction. I wanted to keep you awake tonight. A student named Marcus spoke up from the back. It's because you're using someone as a tool. You're using his body to stop the train. Rowan turned to him. Are you sure? Because when you flip the switch, aren't you using the one person on the track as a tool to redirect the train away from the 5? Marcus frowned. That's not the same, isn't it? Rowan walked to the center of the room. Here's what I promise you. By the end of this course, you will not trust your own moral instincts. You will question every decision you've ever made. You will realize that the line between right and wrong is not where you thought it was. And you will understand that sometimes the scariest thing isn't making the wrong choice. It's realizing you don't know what the right choice is. The class ended in uncomfortable silence. Students filed out slowly, many of them still arguing with each other in hushed voices. Rowan watched them go, knowing what they didn't yet know. This was just the beginning. The easy part. The part where they still believed there were answers. That evening, in Stonewall City Hospital, Dr. Mara Vance was starting a 12-hour shift in the emergency room. She had been an ER physician for 8 years, long enough to have seen almost everything, long enough to have made peace with the impossible choices her job required. She was 36, focused, efficient, the kind of doctor who could make a life or death decision in seconds and then move on to the next patient without hesitation. The accident came in just after 9 p.m. A pile-up on the interstate. Multiple vehicles. The ambulances started arriving in waves. Mara moved through the chaos with practiced precision, triaging patients, directing nurses, making rapid assessments. Critical. Stable. Critical. Stable. It was a brutal calculus, but it was necessary. She had 3 operating rooms available and more patients than she could possibly save. She made her choices based on survival probability. A young man with internal bleeding but strong vitals. A woman with head trauma but responsive pupils. A teenager with multiple fractures but no organ damage. They all made it. They all went home eventually. But there was one patient she turned away from. An older man, maybe 65, with catastrophic injuries. She looked at him, assessed his condition in seconds, and made the call. Comfort care only, she told the nurse. The man died 40 minutes later, alone in a curtained corner of the ER while Mara was saving someone else. She went home that night, took a shower, ate leftover pasta standing at her kitchen counter, and slept soundly. This was the job. This was what emergency medicine required. You couldn't save everyone, so you saved the ones you could. The math was clean. The outcome was maximized. She had made the right choice. But 3 weeks later, something happened that Mara couldn't shake. A man came into the ER with kidney failure. He needed a transplant, but he wasn't high enough on the list. While they were stabilizing him, Mara overheard 2 residents talking in the hallway. One of them was describing a thought experiment they had discussed in a medical ethics class. So there's this surgeon, the resident was saying, and he has 5 patients who need organ transplants. Heart, lungs, kidneys, liver. They'll all die without transplants. Then a healthy guy comes in for a routine checkup. Perfect match for all of them. The surgeon could, theoretically, kill the healthy guy and harvest his organs. 5 lives saved. 1 life lost. Same math as the trolley problem. The other resident laughed uncomfortably. That's insane. No doctor would do that. But why not? If it's all about saving the most lives, what's the difference? Mara stood frozen outside the supply room where she'd been gathering materials. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. The difference? What was the difference? She had let that man die 3 weeks ago because saving him would have meant not saving others. She had played God with the same math. 5 for 1. Maximum survival. Why did this feel so different? She couldn't answer that question. And for the first time in her career, she went home and didn't sleep at all. Back in Ravenport, Caleb Moore was having his own sleepless night. After his talk at the community center, people had started recognizing him around town. Some thanked him. Some avoided eye contact. One man, a stranger, had stopped him outside the grocery store and said, "My father was one of those 5 men on the tracks. Thank you for saving him." Caleb had nodded politely, but inside he felt nothing like gratitude. He felt like a fraud. Because the truth was, he hadn't been thinking about saving 5 lives when he pulled that switch. He had been thinking about not being responsible for 5 deaths. It was a subtle difference, but it mattered. He had acted out of fear, not courage. Out of math, not morality. And now, 42 years later, he wondered if there was a difference at all. If saving lives and avoiding guilt were actually the same thing. If his moment of clarity at the switching station had been moral courage or moral cowardice dressed up in acceptable clothing. He sat in his small living room, the television on but muted, and thought about Thomas Brennan. Thomas had been 28 years old, engaged to be married. His fiancée, Sarah, had come to Caleb's house 2 weeks after the accident. She hadn't screamed or blamed him. She had just asked one question. Did he suffer? Caleb had lied. He had said no, it was instant. But the truth was he didn't know. He hadn't been there. He had just pulled a switch and changed the direction of metal and momentum. He had redirected death like redirecting mail. Clean. Efficient. 5 for 1. The next day in Rowan's class, the students arrived with a different energy. They had been thinking, arguing with roommates, lying awake running through the scenarios. They wanted answers now. They wanted him to explain the contradiction. Rowan had no intention of giving them what they wanted. Instead, he told them another story. "Let's talk about Dr. Mara Vance," he said, though he didn't use her real name. He never used real names. "She's an emergency room physician. One night, there's a mass casualty event. More patients than resources. She has to choose who gets treatment and who doesn't. She saves 5 people. She lets 1 person die. Everyone agrees she did her job correctly. She used her medical expertise to maximize survival. Nobody calls her a murderer. She sleeps fine that night." The students nodded. This made sense to them. Now, Rowan continued, same hospital, different night. A healthy man comes in for a checkup. In the next room, there are 5 patients dying. They each need a different organ. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. The healthy man is a perfect match for all of them. If the doctor kills him and harvests his organs, 5 people live. 1 person dies. Same math. Same outcome. Should she do it? The reaction was immediate and visceral. Students were shaking their heads before Rowan even finished the question. "That's murder," Jessica said firmly. "Is it?" Rowan asked. The other scenario was also choosing who lives and dies. What's different? In the ER, she's responding to an emergency. She's not causing harm. She's just allocating resources. But she's still making the choice that results in 1 person's death when she could have chosen differently. She could have tried to save that 1 person instead of the 5. The fact that she didn't mean she chose. She acted. How is that different from choosing to harvest organs? Marcus spoke up. Because the healthy guy has rights. He came in for a checkup. He wasn't part of the emergency. You can't just use him as spare parts. Why not? If it saves 5 lives? You were willing to push a man off a bridge in our first scenario. 7 of you voted for that. How is this different? The class erupted into argument. Students were talking over each other, voices rising. Rowan let it continue for a few minutes, then held up his hand for silence. "I want you to notice something," he said quietly. "Your moral intuitions are contradicting each other, and you can't explain why. You feel the difference, but you can't articulate it. This is important. This is what I need you to understand. Morality isn't just math. It isn't just outcomes. But it also isn't just rules. It's something else. Something messier. Something human." A student named David raised his hand. "So what is it then? What's the answer?" Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "There isn't one. That's the point. We've built entire philosophical systems trying to solve this problem. Utilitarianism says maximize happiness, minimize suffering. Deontology says follow universal rules. Virtue ethics says cultivate good character. And none of them fully work. None of them give us answers that feel right in every situation. Then what's the point of studying ethics?" David asked, frustrated. "The point," Rowan said, "is to understand that you're going to make moral choices anyway. In your career, in your relationships, in moments of crisis. And those choices will have consequences. Real consequences, not thought experiments. Real people will live or die, suffer or flourish, based on what you decide. And you need to know that certainty is a luxury. That moral clarity is often moral blindness. That the moment you think you have it all figured out is the moment you're most dangerous. The class ended quietly. No arguments this time. Just a heavy, contemplative silence as students gathered their belongings and left. That weekend, the story broke about the lifeboat. It had happened 2 years earlier, but the trial was just concluding, and the verdict made national news. For survivors from a capsized yacht had been found drifting in the Atlantic after 11 days at sea. When they were rescued, there had been 5 of them when they started. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, there were only 4. The youngest, a 19-year-old named Owen Hale, was missing. The survivors claimed he had died from dehydration and they had buried him at sea. But the investigation revealed something else. Owen hadn't died from dehydration. He had been killed, and the other survivors had survived by consuming his flesh. The details emerged slowly, pieced together from inconsistent statements and forensic evidence. The survivors admitted it eventually. Yes, they had killed Owen. Yes, they had done it to survive. They claimed he was dying anyway, that he had been unconscious, that they had no other choice. The prosecution argued it was murder. The defense argued it was survival. The case became a media sensation. Cable news ran segments with ethicists and legal scholars. Social media exploded with opinions. Some people said the survivors were heroes who made an impossible choice. Others said they were murderers who deserved life in prison. The country split down the middle, not along political lines, but along some deeper, harder to define fault line in human moral intuition. Rowan showed the case to his class on Monday. "I want you to vote," he said. "Same rules. Don't overthink it. Trust your instinct. Should the survivors be convicted of murder?" The vote was close. 34 students said yes. 26 said no. But what was striking was how many students looked uncertain as they raised their hands. How many changed their vote at the last second? How many put their hands up halfway, then pulled them back down? "Let me tell you what actually happened," Rowan said. The jury convicted them, not of first-degree murder, but of manslaughter. They acknowledged the extreme circumstances. They acknowledged the desperation. But they also said that killing another person to survive is still killing another person. And society cannot sanction that, even when we understand it. Jessica raised her hand. "That seems harsh. They would have died otherwise." "Maybe," Rowan said. "Probably. But here's the question. If we say it's okay to kill someone to save your own life in that situation, where do we draw the line? What if there had been 6 people in the boat? Do 5 of them get to kill 1? What if they had drawn lots? Would that make it better? What if Owen had volunteered? What if he hadn't? If he volunteered, that's different," Marcus said. "That's his choice." "Is it?" Rowan challenged. "If your choice is volunteer to be killed or watch everyone die, including yourself, is that really a free choice? Is consent meaningful when the alternative is death?" The class struggled with this. They wanted to say yes, consent matters. But they could feel the problem with that answer. Rowan pulled up a historical case. In 1884, there was a yacht called the Mignonette. 4 crew members survived the sinking. After 19 days adrift, 3 of them killed and ate the 4th, a cabin boy named Richard Parker. He was the youngest, the weakest. They chose him because he was already close to death. When they were rescued, they told the truth about what happened. They were tried for murder. The defense argued necessity. The prosecution argued that necessity is never a defense for murder. "What happened?" a student asked. "They were convicted. Sentenced to death." The sentence was later commuted to 6 months in prison. But the legal principle stood. You cannot kill an innocent person to save yourself, even in the most desperate circumstances. Even when the math says it makes sense. "That's insane," David said. "So we're supposed to all die instead?" "Maybe," Rowan said simply. "Maybe that's exactly what morality requires. Maybe the whole point of having rules, of having lines we won't cross, is that they apply even when following them costs us everything. Especially then." The room went quiet. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They had expected a class about theoretical ethics, about abstract principles they could debate from a safe distance. Instead, Rowan was dragging them into the cold water, making them feel the weight of real moral choices, real consequences, real human lives. "Let me tell you about consent," Rowan said, changing the slide. Because I know that's where some of you want to go next. You want to say, what if they had all agreed beforehand? What if before the boat sank, all 5 of them had signed a contract saying that if they ended up adrift, they would draw lots, and whoever lost would be killed so the others could survive? Would that make it okay? He let the question hang. Several students nodded hesitantly. Here's the problem with consent in life or death situations, Rowan continued. Power dynamics. Fear. Coercion. When you're facing death, your ability to make free choices is compromised. You'll agree to things you would never agree to otherwise. You'll sign contracts you don't understand. You'll convince yourself you're making a rational choice, when really you're just trying to cope with terror. He pulled up another case. In 2001, a German man named Armin Maywest posted an ad online. He was looking for someone willing to be killed and eaten. A man named Bernd Brandis responded. They met. They recorded the entire encounter. Brandis explicitly consented, on video, to being killed and consumed. Maywest did exactly what they had agreed to. Should he be convicted of murder? Yes, several students said immediately. Why? Brandis consented. He was an adult. He was of sound mind, at least legally. He wanted this. Who are we to say he couldn't make that choice? Because you can't consent to your own murder, Jessica said. There are some things society can't allow, even with consent. Exactly, Rowan said. We have laws against assisted suicide in most places. We don't let people sell themselves into slavery, even if they want to. We recognize that some choices are so final, so irreversible, that consent isn't enough to make them okay. We draw lines. And those lines exist even when people want to cross them. He paused, letting that sink in. So if consent doesn't make killing acceptable, what about fairness? What if the people in the lifeboat had drawn lots? Everyone had an equal chance. The outcome was random. Does that change anything? The students thought about this. It felt like it should change something. Randomness felt more fair than just choosing the weakest person. But did fairness make killing acceptable? The Mignonette crew didn't draw lots, Rowan said. They just picked the weakest person. That's part of why the court rejected their defense. But would it have been different if they had drawn lots? If Richard Parker had had an equal chance with everyone else? Marcus spoke up. I think so. If everyone agreed to a fair lottery, then nobody can complain about the outcome. Really? Rowan challenged. Let's say we're all in that boat right now. We've been adrift for 2 weeks. We're dying. I suggest we draw lots. One person dies so the rest can live. You all agree. We draw lots. David loses. He drew the short straw. I pull out a knife. Are you telling me that at that moment, when David starts begging for his life, when he says he changed his mind, when he tries to fight back, you're going to hold him down and kill him because he lost a lottery he agreed to? David's face had gone pale. The hypothetical had suddenly become visceral. Personal. That's murder, David said quietly. I don't care what I agreed to. If you kill me, that's murder. But you agreed, Rowan pressed. You drew the lot knowing what it meant. You had an equal chance with everyone else. Why should your fear at the moment of death override our collective agreement? Because I'm a person, David said, his voice rising. Not a statistic. Not a probability. You can't just kill me because I lost a game. Rowan nodded slowly. Exactly. And that's what all of these thought experiments reveal. People aren't numbers. Lives aren't interchangeable units that you can add and subtract. Every moral philosophy that tries to reduce human value to math eventually runs into this problem. The problem of the person standing in front of you, looking you in the eye, asking you not to kill them. He turned off the projector. The classroom lights seemed harsh after the darkness of the presentation. This is why, Rowan said, ancient legal traditions had a principle called you shall not murder. Not, you shall not kill unless the outcome is optimal. Not, you shall not kill unless everyone agreed to a fair process. Just you shall not murder. Because the moment you start making exceptions, the moment you start doing the math, you've already lost something essential about what it means to be human. A student in the back, a quiet woman named Sarah who rarely spoke, raised her hand. But people kill in war, in self-defense, even in capital punishment. So we do make exceptions. We do, Rowan agreed. And every one of those exceptions is controversial. Every one of them requires extensive justification. And even then, many people believe we shouldn't make those exceptions. That all killing is wrong, period. The question isn't whether morality is simple. It's not. The question is whether you're going to pretend it's simple, because that makes you feel better. The class ended. Students filed out slowly, many of them deep in thought. Rowan packed up his materials and headed to his office. He had been teaching this course for 12 years. Every semester, he watched students go through the same progression. Confidence, then confusion, then anger, then something like wisdom. Or at least something like humility. In his office, he found a note that had been slipped under his door. But pulling the switch also felt wrong. Playing God. Choosing who deserved to live and die. Making calculations about human worth based on numbers. Both choices felt wrong. That was the thing nobody had told him. Nobody had said that sometimes every option is terrible. That sometimes you don't get to make a choice that feels clean. You just get to make a choice, period, and then live with it forever. I'm sorry, Caleb said to the headstone. I'm sorry I was the one standing at that switch. I'm sorry it was you. I'm sorry I chose. I'm sorry I didn't choose. I'm sorry there was ever a choice to make. He stood there for a long time, but the dead don't answer. They never do. Back at the hospital, Dr. Mara Vance was having a different kind of crisis. She had always prided herself on her decisiveness, her ability to make hard calls without hesitation. But lately, she found herself second-guessing everything. She would be in the middle of a shift, triaging patients, and suddenly she would freeze. She would see every patient not as a medical case, but as a person with a family, with dreams, with a future that depended on her choice. Last week, she had 2 patients. One was a 60-year-old man with a massive heart attack. Low chance of survival, but possible. The other was a 30-year-old woman with severe trauma from a car accident. High chance of survival if treated immediately. The math was obvious. The choice was clear. Save the woman, let the man die. But Mara kept thinking about the man. About his wife who was in the waiting room, crying. About his grandchildren who would grow up without him. And she thought about the fact that she was playing God, deciding that his life was worth less than someone else's life because of statistics and probabilities. She saved the woman. The man died. Everyone agreed she had made the right choice. But Mara went home that night and couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the moment she had decided one person mattered more than another. She started researching, reading about medical ethics, about triage protocols, about the philosophical frameworks that justified the choices doctors made. And she realized something disturbing. Medicine had solved the trolley problem by pretending it wasn't a problem at all. They had turned it into policy, into procedure, into something you could follow without thinking, without feeling, without recognizing what you were actually doing. You were choosing who lived and died. You were playing God. And the fact that you were doing it according to established guidelines didn't change that. It just made it easier. It let you sleep at night. But Mara didn't want to sleep at night. Not anymore. She wanted to feel the weight of every choice. She wanted to remember every person she couldn't save. Because the moment she stopped feeling that weight, the moment it became routine, was the moment she had lost something essential about being human. She put in her notice the next day. Her supervisor was shocked. "You're one of our best," he said. "We need you." "I know," Mara said. "But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep choosing." "Then what will you do?" She didn't have an answer. She just knew she couldn't be the one standing at the switch anymore. In Rowan's next class, he addressed the elephant in the room. The question everyone wanted answered, but nobody wanted to ask. "What would I do?" he said. "That's what you're all wondering. If I were in the lifeboat, or at the switch, or on the bridge, what would I choose?" The students leaned forward. Finally, they thought. Finally, he would give them an answer. "I don't know," Rowan said simply. "I've thought about it for 20 years. I've read every philosopher, every case study, every argument. And I still don't know. I can tell you what I think I would do. I think I would be paralyzed. I think I would freeze. I think I would want someone else to make the choice so I wouldn't have to live with it." He paused. And that's the most human response there is. Not courage. Not moral clarity. Just the desperate hope that the impossible choice will somehow resolve itself without requiring me to act. But it won't. It never does. Someone always has to choose. And whoever chooses has to live with it forever. Jessica raised her hand. "So what's the point then? If there's no right answer, why are we even talking about this?" "Because," Rowan said, "you need to know what you're capable of. You need to know that when the moment comes, you'll make a choice. And that choice will reveal something about you that you might not want to see. It might reveal that you're capable of killing, or that you're capable of standing by while others die. or that you're capable of doing math with human lives, or that you're capable of drawing arbitrary lines that feel right but can't be justified. He walked to the center of the room. Every one of you will face a trolley problem in your life. Maybe not literally, maybe not with trains and switches, but you'll face a moment where every option is terrible, where you have to choose between different kinds of wrong, where your moral framework shatters and you're left with nothing but your instinct and your conscience and the knowledge that whatever you do, someone will suffer because of it. What am I supposed to do? David asked, and his voice was raw, genuine. This wasn't academic anymore. Feel it, Rowan said. Don't distance yourself. Don't turn it into math. Don't pretend there's a clean answer. Feel the weight of choosing. Feel the horror of it. And then, when you felt all of that, make your choice anyway. Make it knowing that it's terrible. Make it knowing that you'll question it for the rest of your life. But make it, because paralysis is also a choice, and it's usually the worst one. The silence in the room was absolute. Students who had come in expecting philosophical debate had gotten something else entirely. They had gotten permission to be uncertain, permission to be afraid, permission to not have answers. And somehow, that felt more valuable than any answer could have been. Rowan continued, "Let me tell you about a real case. In 2003, a mountain climbing team was descending from a peak in the Himalayas when a storm hit. One of the climbers, a man named Robert, fell and broke his leg. He couldn't walk, couldn't climb. The team had a choice. They could stay with him and likely all die in the storm, or they could leave him and save themselves. They left him. Robert died alone on that mountain. The team made it down safely." He paused. The climbing community was split. Some called the survivors heroes who made a rational choice. Others called them cowards who abandoned their teammate. But here's what's interesting. The survivors didn't defend their choice. They didn't say it was right. They said it was what they did. And they said they would never climb again. Never. Because they couldn't live with who they had become on that mountain. That's what moral injury looks like, Rowan said. Not guilt, not shame, but a fundamental break in your self-concept. You discover you're capable of something you believed you weren't. You do something that makes sense in the moment, but feels unforgivable afterward. And you can't undo it. You can't go back. You just have to carry it. Sarah spoke up from the back. But if they couldn't live with it, doesn't that mean it was wrong? Shouldn't they have stayed and died? Rowan asked. All of them. Would that have been better? More moral? At least they wouldn't have to live with abandoning him. True. But they would be dead. And their families would be grieving. And Robert would still be dead on that mountain. So what's actually improved in that scenario? Sarah struggled for an answer. I don't know. It just feels wrong. Both ways feel wrong. Yes, Rowan said simply. That's exactly right. Both ways feel wrong because both ways are wrong. That's the trolley problem. That's the lifeboat. That's every impossible moral choice. You don't get to choose between right and wrong. You get to choose between wrong and wrong. And then you get to live with whichever wrong you chose. The conversation shifted. Students started sharing their own experiences. Small moments when they had faced moral ambiguity. A student who had reported a friend for cheating and watched their friendship end. Another who hadn't reported it and watched someone graduate with a degree they didn't earn. A student who had stayed silent when someone made a racist comment because speaking up seemed too hard. Another who had spoken up and been ostracized by their entire social group. None of the stories were as dramatic as trains and lifeboats. But they were real, and they hurt, and they revealed the same impossible truth. That doing the right thing sometimes costs everything, and that not doing the right thing also costs everything, and that you have to choose anyway. Rowan let them talk. This was the real lesson. Not the scenarios he presented, but the recognition of their own capacity for moral complexity, for moral failure, for moral courage. As the class wound down, Marcus raised his hand one more time. Can I ask you something personal? Rowan nodded. Have you ever faced a trolley problem? A real one. The room went silent. Students who had been packing up their bags stopped. This was the question they had all wanted to ask, but hadn't dared. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, yes. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain, just that one word. Yes. What did you do? Marcus pressed. I made a choice, Rowan said, and I live with it. That's all I'm going to say. He dismissed the class. Students left slowly, casting glances back at him, wondering what his story was, what choice he had made, what he carried with him. Rowan packed up his materials and returned to his office. He closed the door, sat at his desk, and looked at the photograph he kept in his drawer. His brother, dead for 15 years. Dead because Rowan had been driving, had been tired, had chosen to keep going instead of pulling over, had fallen asleep at the wheel, had survived the crash while his brother hadn't. Rowan had made a choice that night. A stupid, careless choice. Not a moral dilemma. Not a trolley problem. Just exhaustion and stubbornness and the belief that he could make it home safely. And his brother had died because of it. That was his trolley problem. The one he lived with. The one that had driven him into ethics, into philosophy, into this obsessive examination of moral choice. Because he needed to understand how someone could make a decision that resulted in death and still claim to be a good person. He needed to understand how to live with being a killer. Because that's what he was. Not a murderer, but a killer. Someone whose choice had ended a life. And all the philosophy in the world couldn't change that. All the ethical frameworks, all the thought experiments, all the careful reasoning couldn't bring his brother back or absolve him of the weight of that choice. So he taught. He taught students to question their certainty. He taught them to feel the weight of choice. He taught them that moral clarity was often moral blindness. Because if he could prevent even one person from making the kind of careless, thoughtless choice he had made, then maybe his brother's death meant something. It was a utilitarian calculation. One death to prevent many. The kind of math he spent all semester teaching students to question. But it was the only meaning he could find. The only way forward. 3 weeks later, the verdict came down in the lifeboat case. The survivors were sentenced to 2 years in prison, with 1 year suspended. The judge's statement was careful, measured. He acknowledged the extreme circumstances, acknowledged the desperation, acknowledged that none of the defendants had set out to become killers. But, the judge said, society cannot sanction the killing of innocents, even to preserve one's own life. To rule otherwise would be to open a door that could never be closed. To create a precedent that the sanctity of human life can be negotiated when survival is at stake. And that precedent, once established, would lead to horrors. The judge referenced the Mignonette case. He referenced other historical examples. He built a careful legal argument. But underneath the legal language, the message was simple. Some lines cannot be crossed. Some choices cannot be made. And if you cross them anyway, even with the best reasons, even with no other options, you must still face consequences. The defense attorney held a press conference. He was angry, impassioned. My clients are not murderers, he said. They are survivors. They made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. And now society punishes them for having the will to live, for making the choice that anyone would make. But that was the question, wasn't it? Would anyone make that choice? The jury had been split. The country was split. Social media was aflame with arguments. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone believed they knew what they would do. But Rowan knew better. He knew that until you're in the situation, until you feel the hunger and thirst and desperation, until you look at another person and calculate whether their life is worth more than yours, you don't know anything. You have theories. You have beliefs. But you don't have knowledge. Knowledge only comes from experience. And that's the terrible mercy of the trolley problem. Most people never have to face it. Most people get to live their entire lives believing they know what they would do, believing they're good people who would make good choices, without ever being tested. In his next class, Rowan played the audio of the judge's statement. Then he asked the students to vote. Should the survivors have been convicted? This time, the vote was different. 40 students said yes. 20 said no. But what was striking was how many students said, I don't know. They raised both hands. They abstained. They sat there looking uncomfortable and uncertain and unwilling to commit. Good, Rowan said. That's growth. 3 months ago, you all would have had immediate answers. Strong opinions. Moral certainty. Now you see the complexity. Now you see the contradictions. Now you understand that there might not be a right answer. Jessica spoke up. But the judge had to make a decision. The jury had to make a decision. You can't just say, I don't know in court. True, Rowan acknowledged. Sometimes you have to choose even when you don't know. That's what juries do. That's what judges do. That's what all of us do when we make moral choices in the real world. We make our best guess. We follow our instinct. We apply our principles. And then we live with the consequences. But how do you know if you made the right choice? David asked. You don't, Rowan said. You never know for sure. You just make the choice and hope. Hope that you did the least harm. Hope that future generations will judge you kindly. Hope that if you face the same situation again, You would have the courage to make the same choice or the wisdom to make a different one. He pulled up a new slide. Let me tell you one more story. In World War II, there was a resistance fighter in occupied France. He captured a Nazi officer. The officer had information about planned executions. The resistance fighter tortured him, got the information, saved dozens of lives. After the war, the resistance fighter was celebrated as a hero. Rowan paused, but he never recovered from what he did. He died by suicide 10 years later. His final note said he couldn't live with the person he had become. He had saved lives. He had stopped evil. But he had also become a torturer, and that changed him in ways he couldn't undo. The room was silent. This was different from the other scenarios. This involved real evil, real stakes, a real villain who deserved punishment. And yet the moral injury remained. Does it matter that the Nazi officer was evil? Rowan asked. Does that make torture acceptable? Does the righteousness of the cause cleanse the act? I think so, Marcus said. If you're fighting against genocide, against pure evil, then extraordinary measures are justified. Are they? Rowan challenged. Because that's the same logic authoritarian regimes use. We're fighting evil, so we can commit atrocities. We're protecting the nation, so we can torture. We're serving the greater good, so we can sacrifice individuals. Where's the line between necessary evil and becoming evil? The line is intent, Jessica argued. The resistance fighter was trying to save innocent lives. The Nazi was trying to end them. That's the difference. But the act is the same, Rowan said. The torture is the same. The suffering inflicted is the same. If torture is wrong, is it less wrong when done for good reasons? Or is it still wrong, but sometimes necessary? And if it's sometimes necessary, what does that say about morality? He let the question hang. This is what moral absolutism struggles with. The idea that some acts are always wrong, regardless of consequences. Because reality keeps presenting us with situations where doing the wrong thing seems like the only way to prevent something worse. Sarah raised her hand. So are you saying there are no absolute moral rules? That everything is relative? No, Rowan said firmly. I'm saying that absolute rules and consequentialist thinking both fail in different ways. Absolute rules fail when following them leads to catastrophic outcomes. Consequentialist thinking fails when it justifies atrocities in service of the greater good. We need both. We need rules that protect human dignity. And we need the flexibility to recognize when exceptions might be necessary. But we also need to acknowledge that making exceptions comes at a cost. That it damages us. That it should damage us. Why should it damage us if we're doing the right thing? David asked. Because doing terrible things, even for good reasons, should hurt. Should leave scars. The moment you can torture someone, or kill someone, or sacrifice someone without feeling the weight of it, you've lost something essential. You've become capable of atrocity. The moral injury is what keeps us human. It's what prevents us from becoming monsters in service of a cause. The class ended on that heavy note. Students filed out, many of them looking exhausted. This wasn't what they had expected from an ethics course. They had expected debates about theory, about abstract principles. Instead, they had gotten something that felt like trauma, like witnessing something they couldn't unsee. Rowan knew this feeling. He carried it every day. The weight of knowing what humans were capable of. The weight of knowing what he was capable of. He had killed his brother through carelessness. He had tortured himself with guilt for 15 years. And he had learned that no amount of philosophical reasoning could lift that weight. You just learned to carry it. But carrying it mattered. Because the people who didn't feel the weight were the dangerous ones. The people who could make cold calculations. The people who could kill 5 to save 1, or kill 1 to save 5, and sleep soundly afterward. Those were the people who built concentration camps, who launched genocides, who committed atrocities and called it justice. The weight, the moral injury, the inability to ever feel clean again, that was the price of maintaining humanity in an inhumane world. And it was a price worth paying. Meanwhile, Caleb Moore was having a conversation he had avoided for 42 years. He had finally tracked down Sarah Brennan, Thomas's fiancée. She was 70 now, remarried for 35 years, with grandchildren. But she still visited Thomas's grave every week. Still kept his memory alive. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Ravenport. Caleb had rehearsed what he would say, but when he saw her, all his prepared words evaporated. He just looked at her and said, "I'm sorry." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "You're the one who pulled the switch." "Yes." Everyone told me you saved lives. 5 men who would have died. 5 families that stayed intact. I was supposed to be grateful, I think. Grateful that only my Thomas died instead of 5 strangers. I don't expect gratitude, Caleb said. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I think about him. Every day for 42 years. I think about what he lost. What you lost. What I took from both of you. Sarah was quiet. Then she said something that surprised him. I don't blame you. Caleb looked up sharply. I've had 4 decades to think about this, Sarah continued. To be angry. To imagine different outcomes. And I realized something. You didn't put Thomas on that track. You didn't cause the train to lose its brakes. You didn't create the situation. You were just the person standing at the switch when the impossible happened. But I chose, Caleb said. I decided his life was worth less than 5 lives. Did you? Sarah asked. Or did you decide that 5 deaths were worse than 1 death? That's different. You weren't measuring his worth. You were counting outcomes. Is that better? I don't know, Sarah said honestly. But I think it's human. I think it's what most people would do. And I think torturing yourself for 40 years hasn't brought him back or changed anything. It's just meant 2 lives were destroyed that day instead of 1. Caleb felt something break inside him. Not relief, not absolution, but a shift. A slight loosening of the weight he had carried for so long. I loved him, Sarah said. I will always love him. But I also lived. I remarried. I had children. I built a life. And I think he would have wanted that for me. Just like I think he would want you to forgive yourself. I don't know how, Caleb admitted. Neither do I, Sarah said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe some things we just carry. Maybe that's what love means. What responsibility means. We carry the weight of the choices we make and the people we lose, and we don't get to put it down. They talked for another hour. About Thomas. About the life he had lost. About the lives that had been saved. About the 5 men who had lived because of Caleb's choice, and the families they had built, and the grandchildren who existed because their grandfathers hadn't died on those tracks 42 years ago. It didn't make it right. It didn't erase the choice. But it complicated it. It added layers that Caleb had never considered. He had thought of himself as a killer for 42 years. But maybe he was also a savior. Maybe he was both. Maybe that's what it meant to make impossible choices. You became multiple things at once, contradictory things, and you had to learn to live with all of them. Back at the university, Dr. Rowan was preparing his final lecture of the semester. He had spent 12 weeks breaking down his students' moral certainty. Now he needed to give them something to rebuild with. Not answers, but tools. Not solutions, but approaches. The classroom was full when he arrived. Students who had stopped coming to class were back. Word had spread about this final lecture. About what Rowan would say. About whether he would finally give them the answer they had been seeking all semester. He began without preamble. I'm going to tell you what I believe. Not what's true. Not what's right. Just what I believe, after 20 years of studying ethics and 15 years of living with the consequences of a terrible choice. The room was absolutely silent. I believe, Rowan said, that there are 2 fundamental approaches to morality. One is deontological. It says that certain acts are always wrong, regardless of consequences. Murder is wrong. Torture is wrong. Using people as means to an end is wrong. Period. Full stop. No exceptions. He paused. The other approach is consequentialist. It says that the morality of an act depends on its outcomes. If killing 1 person saves 5, then killing that person is not only acceptable but obligatory. The math is simple. Minimize suffering. Maximize well-being. Calculate the outcome and act accordingly. Both of these approaches have merit, Rowan continued. Both of them capture something true about morality. But both of them also fail in crucial ways. Deontological ethics fails when following absolute rules leads to catastrophic outcomes. Consequentialist ethics fails when it reduces human beings to numbers in a calculation. He walked to the center of the room. So what do we do? How do we make moral choices when both frameworks are insufficient? He paused, letting the question sit. We recognize that morality is not a system. It's not a formula. It's not something you can solve like a math problem. Morality is a practice. It's something you do, moment by moment, choice by choice, always aware that you might be wrong. Here's what I've learned, Rowan said. First, moral intuitions matter. That feeling of revulsion when you imagine pushing someone off a bridge matters. It's not just emotion. It's moral knowledge encoded in our deepest instincts. But intuitions can also be wrong, can be biased, can be shaped by culture and prejudice, so we can't trust them blindly. Second, consequences matter. We have a responsibility to consider the outcomes of our actions, to try to minimize harm and maximize flourishing. But we can't reduce morality to pure calculation, because that path leads to justifying anything if the math works out. Third, rules matter. We need bright lines. We need to say that some things are wrong, period. Because without those lines, we're capable of terrible things. But rules also need to be held lightly enough that we can recognize when truly exceptional circumstances might demand exception. Fourth, moral injury matters. If you make a choice that saves lives but requires killing, you should carry that weight. You should be changed by it. The moment you can kill without remorse, even for good reasons, you've become dangerous. And finally, Rowan said, humility matters. The recognition that you might be wrong, that your framework might be insufficient, that the person you're arguing with might see something you don't. That moral certainty is often the enemy of moral truth. A student raised her hand. So how do I actually make a decision? When I'm facing a trolley problem, what do? Rowan smiled sadly. You make your best guess. You consider the consequences. You check your intuition. You apply your principles. You ask yourself if you can live with the choice. And then you choose, knowing you might be wrong. Knowing you'll question it forever. Knowing that whatever you do, someone will suffer. That's not very comforting, the student said. It's not supposed to be, Rowan replied. Ethics isn't about comfort. It's about responsibility. And responsibility is heavy. It should be heavy. He pulled up his final slide. It was a quote from Primo Levi, a Holocaust survivor. There are no simple truths. Even faced with the most horrific circumstances, the simplicity of dividing humanity into victims and perpetrators doesn't hold. There are gray zones. There are impossible choices. There are people who become complicit in their own survival. And we cannot judge them, because we were not there. This is what I want you to leave with, Rowan said. Not answers, not solutions, but the recognition that moral life is complex. That good people face impossible choices. That sometimes every option is terrible, and that we still have to choose. He dismissed the class for the final time. Students didn't move immediately. They sat there, processing. Some were crying quietly. Others looked stunned. They had come into this course expecting to learn about right and wrong. Instead, they had learned about ambiguity and uncertainty and the weight of being human. As they filed out, many stopped to shake Rowan's hand, to thank him. Some looked angry. One student said, "You've ruined me. I can't think about anything the same way anymore." "Good," Rowan said. "That means you're paying attention." After everyone left, Rowan sat alone in the empty classroom. He thought about his brother, about the choice he had made to keep driving, about all the choices he hadn't made in the 15 years since, the relationships he had avoided because he couldn't bear the vulnerability, the opportunities he had passed on because he believed he didn't deserve happiness, the wall he had built around himself using philosophy and logic and the careful examination of moral choice. He had spent 15 years teaching other people about the weight of moral decisions, but he had never learned to put down his own weight. He had never forgiven himself. He had never allowed himself to move forward. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to stop using his brother's death as a shield against life. Maybe it was time to recognize that survival, even when you're the one who caused the accident, didn't make you a monster. It just made you human. Flawed. Capable of terrible mistakes. But still human. He packed up his materials and walked out of the building. The sun was setting, painting the campus in gold and amber light. Students were laughing, talking, living their lives. And for the first time in 15 years, Rowan felt like maybe he could join them. Maybe he could stop standing apart, analyzing and judging and protecting himself with intellectual distance. Maybe he could just be imperfect, uncertain, carrying his weight but not letting it crush him. Across town, Dr. Mara Vance was starting a new job. She had left emergency medicine and taken a position in hospice care. It was different, slower. Instead of making split-second decisions about who lived and died, she sat with people who were dying and helped them find peace. There was no trolley problem in hospice. No impossible choices. Just the simple reality that everyone dies, and the best you could do was make that transition as gentle as possible. There was grief, yes. Loss, yes. But there was also something like acceptance. Something like grace. She sat with an elderly woman named Margaret who was in her final days. Margaret's family had said their goodbyes. Now it was just the two of them, Mara and this dying woman, in the quiet of a private room. "I'm scared," Margaret whispered. "I know," Mara said, holding her hand. "Did I live a good life?" Mara looked at her. "Did you love people?" "Yes." "Did you try your best?" "Most of the time." "Did you hurt people?" "Sometimes. Not on purpose. But yes." "Then you lived a human life," Mara said. "That's all any of us can do." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought there would be more clarity at the end. I thought I would know if I was good or bad. But it's still complicated. Still messy." "It always is," Mara said. "We want simple answers. We want to know we did the right thing. But life doesn't work that way. We make choices with incomplete information. We do our best. We hurt people and help people, often at the same time. And in the end, all we can do is accept that we were human." Margaret smiled slightly. "You're good at this." "At what?" "At sitting with the mess. At not pretending there are easy answers." Mara thought about the ER. About all the times she had pretended there were easy answers. About how protocol and procedure had let her avoid the weight of choosing. And she realized that this, right here, was what she had been missing. The willingness to sit with someone in their fear and uncertainty and not try to fix it. Not try to solve it. Just be present for it. Margaret died 3 hours later, peacefully, and Mara sat with her body for a while, honoring the life that had been lived, the complexity that had been carried, the weight that was finally released. She went home that night and slept better than she had in months. The survivors of the lifeboat were released from prison after serving 18 months. The media was there to document it. Cameras, reporters, questions shouted as they walked to waiting cars. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. They just left, quickly and quietly, trying to disappear into private life. One of them, a man named Thomas, not the same Thomas as in Caleb's story, but the coincidence felt significant, gave an interview 6 months later. He had lost everything. His job, his marriage, most of his friends. People recognized him, crossed the street to avoid him, left restaurants when he walked in. "Do you regret what you did?" the interviewer asked. Thomas thought for a long time. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally said. "I regret the circumstances that led to that moment. I regret that we were in that boat at all. But do I regret making the choice we made? I don't know how to answer that. If I say yes, I'm saying we should have all died. If I say no, I'm saying killing is acceptable when survival is at stake. Both of those feel wrong. What do you say to people who call you a murderer? I say they're right. I am. I killed someone. The fact that I had reasons, that I was desperate, that I would have died otherwise, none of that changes what I did. I took a life. I will carry that for the rest of my life. What do you say to people who call you a survivor? I say they're also right. I survived. Owen didn't. That's the reality. I'm alive because of a choice we made, and I can't undo it, and I can't pretend it didn't happen. So I survive. I keep going. I try to be worthy of the life I kept. How do you do that? How do you live with it? Thomas looked directly at the camera. I don't know. I wake up every day and I try. Some days are harder than others. Some days I can't get out of bed. Some days I function almost normally. But every day, I remember. I remember Owen. I remember his face. I remember what we did. And I carry it. That's all I can do. The interview ended. Thomas disappeared from public life after that. Some people said he moved to Alaska. Others said he became a counselor for trauma survivors. Nobody knew for sure. He had become a ghost, haunting the edges of a story that nobody wanted to remember but couldn't forget. In Ravenport, Caleb Moore made a decision. He couldn't undo what had happened 42 years ago. He couldn't bring Thomas Brennan back, but he could do something to honor his memory. He established a scholarship in Thomas's name at the local community college. Full tuition for one student every year who wanted to study engineering. Thomas had been an engineer, had loved trains, loved the precision and logic of mechanical systems. The scholarship was funded by Caleb's railroad pension, money he had earned doing the job that had put him at that switch on that terrible day. It felt right somehow, taking what came from that moment and turning it into something good. Not to erase the past, not to buy absolution, just to acknowledge that from terrible choices, something positive could still grow. The first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Emma. She had no idea about the story behind the scholarship. She just knew that someone named Thomas Brennan had made it possible for her to get an education she couldn't otherwise afford. When she graduated, Caleb was there. He shook her hand and said, "Make it count." "I will," she promised. And Caleb thought, maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, just continuing to move forward, carrying the weight, but not letting it stop you from trying to do some good in the world. Back at the university, months after the course ended, Dr. Rowan received an email from David, the student who had asked so many questions. The email was short. "Professor Rowan, I thought you should know. I was at a traffic accident last week. Car ran a red light and hit a motorcycle. The rider was badly injured. I'm the only one who knew CPR. I kept him alive until the ambulance arrived. The doctor said if I hadn't been there, he would have died. I just wanted you to know that your class mattered. You taught me that moral choices are complicated, but you also taught me that we still have to make them, that we can't be paralyzed by uncertainty. So I made a choice. I tried to help, and it worked. Thank you." Rowan read the email 3 times. Then he saved it in a folder with the others. Moments where his work had mattered, where breaking down certainty had created better people, not more confused people, where teaching humility had led to courage. He responded simply, "You did good. Keep doing good, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Then he started preparing for next semester's class. Same course, same scenarios, same impossible questions. A new group of students who thought they knew the difference between right and wrong. He would challenge them, break them down, build them back up, teach them that morality isn't about having answers. It's about being willing to sit with the questions. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the best anyone could do. Sit with the questions, acknowledge the complexity, make choices anyway, and try to be worthy of the weight those choices carried. The story of the train, the lifeboat, the bridge, the classroom, all of these scenarios, they weren't really about trains or boats or bridges. They were about us, about what we're capable of, about the lines we draw and the lines we cross, about the weight of being human in a world that constantly presents impossible choices. And the truth was, there was no answer. There was no solution to the trolley problem. There was just the eternal tension between competing values, between outcomes and principles, between utilitarianism and deontology, between saving lives and preserving dignity, between the math that says 1 death is better than 5 and the feeling that says you can't kill an innocent person no matter what the math says. We live in that tension. We make our choices in that tension. And we carry the consequences of those choices, good and bad, right and wrong, for the rest of our lives. That's not a satisfying ending. It's not neat. It's not clean. It doesn't provide closure or resolution or the comfort of knowing we did the right thing. But it's true. And sometimes truth is more important than comfort. The world kept turning. Trains kept running on tracks. Boats kept sailing on oceans. People kept making impossible choices in emergency rooms and courtrooms and ordinary moments that suddenly became extraordinary. And philosophers kept asking the same questions humans had been asking for thousands of years. What do we owe each other? What makes an action right or wrong? How do we weigh one life against another? When is it acceptable to sacrifice the few for the many? When is it never acceptable? These weren't academic questions. They were alive, breathing in every decision we made. In politics, when leaders decided which communities got resources and which didn't. In medicine, when doctors triaged patients during pandemics. In economics, when executives made choices that benefited shareholders while harming workers. In law, when judges decided whether extreme circumstances could ever justify extreme actions. The trolley problem wasn't a thought experiment. It was reality, dressed in different clothes, appearing in different contexts, asking the same fundamental question over and over again. What will you do when every option is terrible? A year after Rowan's class ended, 5 of his former students met for coffee. They had stayed in touch, bonded by the shared experience of having their moral certainty systematically dismantled. They talked about where they were now, what they were doing, how the class had changed them. Jessica was in law school. She said she thought about the trolley problem every time she studied criminal defense. "I used to think justice was simple," she said. "Someone commits a crime, they get punished. But now I see all the gray areas. The desperate circumstances. The impossible choices. The way the system sometimes punishes people for being human." Marcus had become a social worker. "I work with families in crisis," he said. "Parents who can't afford to feed their kids. People choosing between medication and rent. And I realized the trolley problem is just poverty by another name. Impossible choices made by people with no good options. David was studying medicine. I used to think doctors were supposed to save everyone, he said. But Rowan taught me that's impossible. You can't save everyone. You have to choose. And that choice is going to haunt you regardless of what you decide. So now I'm trying to learn how to make those choices while still honoring the humanity of every patient. Sarah had become a journalist. I write about people facing impossible situations, she said. Refugees deciding whether to risk their children's lives crossing borders. Parents deciding whether to keep kids in dangerous neighborhoods or send them away. People who become the trolley problem and have to live with whatever choice they make. And the fifth student, a quiet young man named James who had rarely spoken in class, surprised everyone. I became a train engineer, he said. Like Caleb Moore. I wanted to understand what it felt like to have that much responsibility. To know that every decision you make could mean life or death. Have you ever faced a situation like his? Jessica asked. James shook his head. Not yet, but I think about it every time I'm at the controls. I imagine the scenario. I try to prepare mentally for the moment when I might have to choose. And I don't know what I'll do. I genuinely don't know. But I think being aware of that uncertainty is better than being certain and wrong. They talked for hours. About the class. About morality. About the weight of being human. And they realized that Rowan hadn't ruined them. He had prepared them. He had given them the tools to navigate a world that constantly demanded impossible choices. Not answers. Not solutions. But awareness. Humility. The capacity to sit with uncertainty and still act with integrity. Meanwhile, in a prison counseling session, one of the lifeboat survivors was talking with a therapist. His name was Robert, and he had been struggling since his release. Nightmares. Flashbacks. An inability to connect with anyone who hadn't been in that boat. I keep thinking about consent, he said. We told the court that Owen would have wanted us to survive. That he would have agreed if he had been conscious. But the truth is, we don't know that. We told ourselves that story to make it bearable. But we don't know. The therapist was quiet, letting him continue. And even if he had agreed, even if we had drawn lots and he had lost, it wouldn't change what we did. We killed him. We consumed his body. No amount of rationalization changes that. No amount of desperation makes it acceptable. But you survived, the therapist said gently. Did I? Robert asked. Because the person who got on that boat isn't the person who got off. That person died out there. I'm just what's left. A ghost. A shell. Going through the motions of living without actually being alive. What would make you feel alive again? Robert thought for a long time. I don't know if I deserve to feel alive. Owen doesn't get to feel alive. Why should I? Survivor's guilt, the therapist said. No, Robert corrected. Survivor's reality. I survived because he died. That's not guilt. That's fact. And I don't know how to live with that fact. The therapist tried different approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Trauma processing. Mindfulness. But nothing seemed to reach Robert. He was trapped in that boat, in that moment, in the choice they had made and couldn't unmake. Finally, the therapist suggested something different. Have you considered talking to Owen's family? Not to seek forgiveness, just to acknowledge what happened, to hear their grief, to sit with it instead of running from it. Robert looked horrified. They hate me. Why would they want to talk to me? Maybe they do hate you. Maybe they won't want to talk. But maybe they need to. Maybe they need to look you in the eye and tell you what your choice cost them. And maybe you need to hear it. Maybe that's the only way forward. Robert thought about it for weeks. Then, with his therapist's help, he reached out to Owen's parents. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't try to explain or justify. Just said he was willing to meet if they wanted to. Willing to listen. Willing to bear witness to their pain. To his surprise, they agreed. They met in a church, neutral ground. Owen's parents, Robert, and a mediator. For the first hour, Owen's mother just cried. His father sat stone-faced, arms crossed. Robert sat across from them, hands folded, saying nothing. Finally, Owen's father spoke. I want to understand, he said. I want to understand how you could do that. How you could kill my son. Robert didn't flinch. We were dying. All of us. We had been without food or water for days. Owen was unconscious. Fading. We convinced ourselves he was already gone. That we were just using his body to save ourselves. But that's a lie. We killed him. We made that choice. Why him? Why not you? Why not draw lots? Because we were cowards, Robert said simply. We wanted to survive. We looked for the person who was already closest to death and told ourselves it was mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was murder. Owen's mother looked up, her eyes red. Do you think about him? Every day? Every hour? Every moment? I see his face. I hear his voice. I carry him with me. Good, she said fiercely. You should. You should never stop carrying him. You should never have a moment of peace. You took my son from me. You took his future, his children, his life. And you're still here. Robert nodded. I know. And I can never make that right. I can never give him back to you. All I can do is carry the weight of what we did and try to be worthy of the life I kept. How? Owen's father demanded. How are you going to be worthy? I don't know, Robert admitted. I'm trying to figure that out. I work with a suicide prevention hotline now. I talk to people who are considering giving up. I tell them their life matters. I try to honor Owen by protecting life whenever I can. But I know it's not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Owen's mother said something that surprised everyone. He was a good person. My son. He was kind. Gentle. He would have hated knowing you were suffering like this. Robert looked up, shocked. I'm not forgiving you, she clarified quickly. I can't forgive you. But Owen could have. He would have. That was who he was. So maybe what you owe him isn't suffering. Maybe what you owe him is living. Really living. Not just surviving with guilt, but actually doing something meaningful with the life you have. Robert started crying then. Deep, racking sobs. The first tears he had allowed himself since the boat. He cried for Owen. For himself. For the impossible choice and its impossible consequences. For the weight that would never fully lift but might, maybe, become bearable. The meeting ended with no resolution. No forgiveness. No absolution. But something had shifted. Owen's parents had gotten to speak their truth. Robert had gotten to hear it. And in that exchange, in that bearing of witness, some small piece of healing had begun. Not healing that erased the past. Not healing that made everything okay. But healing that acknowledged the reality of what had happened and created space for everyone to continue existing despite it. Back at the university, Dr. Rowan was giving a guest lecture for a philosophy conference. The topic was moral psychology, and he had been asked to speak about his teaching methods. The room was full of other professors, all of them interested in how he managed to engage students so deeply with ethical questions. He began by telling them about Caleb Moore, about the train, about the switch, about the 42 years of carrying that choice. When I teach ethics, he said, I don't start with theory. I start with stories. Real stories about real people making real choices. Because theory is comfortable. Theory lets us pretend we're above the mess of actual moral decision-making. But we're not. None of us are. He showed them data, student evaluations, long-term follow-up studies, evidence that students who took his course were more likely to engage in prosocial behavior, more likely to question authority, more likely to act ethically in ambiguous situations. But more importantly, they were less likely to act with false certainty, less likely to make sweeping moral judgments, less likely to dehumanize people who made different choices. I don't teach my students what to think, Rowan said. I teach them how to think, how to sit with uncertainty, how to recognize their own capacity for moral failure, how to make choices while acknowledging they might be wrong. A professor from another school raised his hand. But doesn't that lead to moral relativism? If there are no right answers, why follow any moral principles at all? It's not that there are no right answers, Rowan explained. It's that the right answer isn't always obvious. And the process of figuring out what's right requires engaging with complexity, not reducing it. Moral relativism says all choices are equal. I'm saying all choices have weight, and we need to feel that weight. But how do we act if we're always uncertain? We act with humility, Rowan said. We make our best judgment. We commit to our choice. But we remain open to the possibility that we're wrong. We listen to criticism. We adjust when we get new information. And we accept moral injury as the price of being human. Another professor challenged him. You're teaching paralysis. Students who are too afraid to make decisions because they might be wrong. No, Rowan said firmly. I'm teaching awareness. There's a difference between paralysis and thoughtfulness. Between uncertainty and cowardice. My students act. They just act with their eyes open. They don't hide behind moral certainty or convenient frameworks. They face the full weight of their choices. The conference continued for hours, with vigorous debate about Rowan's methods. Some professors loved his approach. Others thought it was dangerous. but everyone agreed that he was touching something important, something that traditional ethics education missed. After the conference, a young professor approached him. "I want to teach like you do," she said, "but I'm afraid. Afraid of breaking my students. Afraid of causing harm." Rowan looked at her thoughtfully. "If you're not afraid, you're not paying attention," he said. "Teaching ethics is dangerous. You're messing with people's fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. You're showing them that the world is more complicated than they thought. That's going to hurt. It should hurt. But the alternative is worse." "What's the alternative?" "Certainty," Rowan said. "Moral absolutism. The kind of thinking that leads to atrocities. Because when you're certain you're right, when you believe your cause is just and your framework is correct, you can justify anything. You can kill for the greater good. You can torture for national security. You can sacrifice individuals for the collective. Certainty is what allows humans to commit horrors while believing they're heroes." The young professor nodded slowly. "So we teach doubt. We teach humility," Rowan corrected. "Doubt that leads to inaction is just as dangerous as certainty. But humility that leads to careful, thoughtful, revisable action, that's wisdom. That's what we're trying to cultivate." She thanked him and left. Rowan stood alone in the empty conference hall, thinking about his brother again. About the certainty he had felt that night when he decided to keep driving. About how sure he had been that he could make it home safely. About how that certainty had killed the person he loved most in the world. If he had been less certain, he would have pulled over, would have rested, would have saved his brother's life. His certainty had been his brother's death sentence. So he taught doubt. He taught awareness. He taught the importance of questioning yourself, especially when you felt most sure. Because certainty was comfortable, but it was also deadly. Across the country, in a small town in Oregon, Caleb Moore was giving his last interview. He was 80 years old now, his health failing. A documentary filmmaker had tracked him down, wanting to include his story in a film about moral dilemmas in professional life. Caleb sat in his living room, the camera pointed at him, and answered questions he had been answering for decades. But this time, something was different. This time, he had clarity. "You asked me if I would make the same choice again," Caleb said to the interviewer. "And for 50 years, I couldn't answer that question. I didn't know. I was paralyzed by not knowing. But now, at the end of my life, I can tell you. Yes, I would pull the switch again." The interviewer leaned forward. "Why? What changed?" "I met the families," Caleb said. "I saw the lives that were lived because of my choice. I saw the grandchildren, the careers, the love, the joy. All of it exists because those 5 men didn't die that day. And while I will always mourn Thomas, while I will always carry the weight of his death, I can also acknowledge that something good came from something terrible." "But you killed him." "I did," Caleb said simply. "I made a choice that resulted in his death, and I've carried that for 50 years. But I've also learned that carrying weight doesn't mean being crushed by it. You can carry something heavy and still move forward. You can acknowledge harm and still believe the choice was necessary. So you think you made the right choice?" Caleb paused. "I think I made a human choice. I don't know if it was right. I don't know if such a thing as a right choice even exists in that situation. But it was my choice, and I own it. And I've tried to live in a way that honors both Thomas's memory and the lives that were saved." The interview ended. Caleb died 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep. At his funeral, 5 families showed up. The families of the men he had saved. They spoke about him with gratitude and respect. They acknowledged the impossible position he had been in. They thanked him for his courage. But they also acknowledged Thomas. They had contributed to the scholarship in his name. They had kept his memory alive. Because they understood that their lives had come at a cost, and that cost deserved to be honored. One of the grandsons, a young man named Michael whose grandfather had been on those tracks, spoke at the funeral. "Caleb Moore made a choice that gave my grandfather 40 more years of life," he said. "Because of that choice, I exist. My sister exists. Our children exist. We are the ripple effects of a decision made in 15 seconds 50 years ago. But we also know that our existence came at the cost of Thomas Brennan's life. That we're here because he's not. And we carry that knowledge. We honor it. We try to live in a way that justifies the choice Caleb made. I don't know if that's possible," Michael continued. "I don't know if any life can justify another life. But I know that denying the complexity, pretending the choice was simple, would dishonor both Caleb and Thomas. So we remember. We acknowledge. We carry the weight together. It was the most honest eulogy anyone had ever heard, and it captured something essential about the trolley problem, about all moral dilemmas. That the weight wasn't meant to be carried alone, that communities, families, entire generations shared the burden of impossible choices. After the funeral, Sarah Brennan, now 90 years old, stood at Thomas's grave with Michael. "Your grandfather lived because mine died," she said. "I used to resent that, used to think it was unfair. But I've lived a long life since then. I've seen how interconnected we all are, how one choice ripples out in ways we can never fully understand." "Do you forgive Caleb?" Michael asked. Sarah thought for a long time. Forgiveness implies there was something to forgive, a wrong that needs to be absolved. But I don't think Caleb did something wrong. He did something impossible, and he carried it with honor. So I don't forgive him. I respect him, and I hope he's at peace. They stood together in silence, a shared history between them, built on a choice made 50 years ago by a man who just wanted to do the least harm possible. Back at the university, Dr. Rowan was teaching his course again. New students, same scenarios, same progression from certainty to confusion to something like wisdom. But this semester, something was different. Rowan had changed. He still taught the trolley problem, still showed the contradictions in moral intuition, still refused to give easy answers. But now he also talked about his brother, about the choice he had made and its consequences, about how he had used philosophy as armor against grief. "I spent 15 years studying ethics because I couldn't forgive myself for a careless mistake," he told his students. "I thought if I could understand morality perfectly, if I could build an unassailable framework for right and wrong, then maybe I could prove to myself that I wasn't a monster, that I was just human." The students listened in stunned silence. They had never heard him be this personal, this vulnerable. "But that's not how it works," Rowan continued. "You can't reason your way out of grief. You can't logic your way into absolution. You just have to feel it, carry it, accept it as part of who you are. Not your whole identity, but a piece of it. A scar that's healed but still visible." "What changed?" a student asked. "I forgave myself," Rowan said simply. "Not because I decided I had done nothing wrong, but because I realized that punishing myself forever wasn't honoring my brother. It was just ego, just me making his death about my guilt instead of about his life." "How do you forgive yourself for something like that?" another student asked. "You don't, really," Rowan said. "You just decide to stop making it the center of everything. You acknowledge what happened. You honor the person you lost. And then you try to live in a way that reflects what they meant to you. You keep going. Not because you deserve to, but because staying stuck is its own kind of death." The class was different after that. More honest. More raw. Students shared their own experiences with moral failure, with guilt, with the weight of choices they regretted. And Rowan listened, no longer hiding behind the persona of the all-knowing professor, just being human with them, sitting in the mess of moral life together. At the end of the semester, he gave his final lecture. But instead of summarizing the course, instead of trying to provide closure, he did something different. He invited Mara Vance to speak. Mara stood in front of the class, nervous but determined. "Dr. Rowan asked me to talk about what happens after you face your trolley problem," she said. "About how you keep living after you've made an impossible choice." She told them about the ER, about the patients she had saved and the patients she hadn't, about the night she realized she had been playing God and pretending it was just medicine, about quitting, about hospice, about learning to sit with death instead of fighting it. "I can't tell you the right answer," she said. "I can only tell you what I learned. That some people can make those choices and be okay, and some people can't. And both of those are valid responses. You have to know yourself, know your limits, know what you can carry and what will break you. But here's the important part," she continued. "Breaking isn't failure. I broke. I couldn't do emergency medicine anymore, and I felt like I had failed. But then I found something else, something that fit who I was better. And I realized that recognizing your limits isn't weakness. It's wisdom." "What if recognizing your limits means people die?" a student asked. "If you're the only doctor in an emergency situation and you can't handle the pressure, people suffer." "That's true," Mara acknowledged. "And that's why these choices are impossible. Because every option has costs. If I had stayed in the ER, I would have eventually made a mistake. I would have chosen wrong because I was too burned out to think clearly. So by leaving, I might have saved lives. Or I might have cost lives. I don't know. I'll never know. I just made the choice that felt like I could live with it." The students asked her questions for an hour. about medical ethics, about triage, about how doctors made decisions about who lived and died. And through it all, Mara was honest. She didn't pretend to have answers. She just shared her experience, her struggle, her humanity. When she left, the students sat quietly, processing. Then Rowan spoke one last time. "This is what I want you to remember," he said. "Ethics isn't about being perfect. It's not about always making the right choice. It's about being present for the full weight of your choices. It's about recognizing that you're capable of both great good and great harm. And it's about choosing to show up anyway, to try anyway, to care anyway, even though you might fail. That's all any of us can do. Show up, try, care, fail sometimes, succeed sometimes, but always, always carry the weight. Always feel the weight of what it means to be human in a world that demands impossible choices." He dismissed the class. Students filed out slowly, many of them emotional. This course had changed them, not by giving them answers, but by taking away their certainty, by showing them that moral life was messy and complicated and beautiful and terrible all at once. As Rowan packed up his materials, a student approached him. It was Jessica, now in her final year. She had taken his class 3 years ago and had stayed in touch ever since. "I have something to tell you," she said. Rowan looked up, concerned by her tone. "I was on a jury last month. Murder case. The defendant claimed self-defense. Everyone else wanted to acquit immediately. They said it was obvious. But I kept thinking about your class, about contradictions, about how the obvious answer is often wrong." She paused. I pushed back. I asked questions. I made them deliberate. We spent 4 days going through every piece of evidence. And we found inconsistencies in the defendant's story. Things that didn't add up. If I hadn't slowed everyone down, if I had just gone with my gut instinct, we would have let a guilty man go free. Rowan felt something tighten in his chest. "You did good. But here's the thing," Jessica continued. "I felt terrible about it. Questioning him, doubting his story, making everyone scrutinize his trauma. It felt cruel. It felt like I was the bad person in the room. But I did it anyway because I knew certainty was dangerous." "That's moral courage," Rowan said. "Not feeling good about your choice, but making it anyway because it's necessary. That's exactly what I hoped you would learn." Jessica nodded, tears in her eyes. "I just wanted you to know that it mattered. Your class mattered. You ruined me in the best possible way." After she left, Rowan sat alone in the empty classroom. He thought about his brother, about how his death had created ripples that reached this far, how one terrible choice had led to 15 years of study, which had led to teaching, which had led to thousands of students learning to question their certainty, which had led to Jessica making a decision that put a guilty man in prison. Was that redemption? Was that meaning? He didn't know, but it was something, a way forward, a way to turn tragedy into something that mattered. Across the country, in various cities and towns, people were living with their trolley problems. Some carried them well, others were crushed by them, but all of them were trying to be human, trying to do better, trying to live with the weight of impossible choices. There was a surgeon in Seattle who had made a decision during a mass casualty event. She had chosen to save a young mother instead of an elderly man. Both were critical, both were savable, but she could only work on one at a time. She chose the mother. The elderly man died. The mother lived, went home to her 3 children. The surgeon carried the elderly man's death with her. She attended his funeral. She met his family. She apologized even though they told her she had done nothing wrong. She carried it anyway because that's what it meant to take responsibility for your choices. There was a police officer in Chicago who had been in a hostage situation. The gunman had a child. The officer had a clear shot. He took it, killed the gunman, saved the child. By all accounts, he was a hero. But he couldn't sleep, couldn't stop seeing the gunman's face, couldn't stop thinking about the fact that he had ended a human life, even though that life was threatening others. He went to therapy. He talked to other officers who had been in similar situations. He learned that moral injury was normal, that you could do the right thing and still be traumatized by it. That saving lives didn't erase the cost of taking one. There was a mother in Phoenix who had left her abusive husband, taking her children with her. She knew it would hurt him, knew it might even destroy him, but she also knew staying would destroy her and her children. So she chose. She left. Her husband spiraled into depression and addiction. She felt responsible, felt guilty, but she also knew she had made the only choice she could live with. She went to support groups for domestic violence survivors. She learned that protecting yourself and your children wasn't selfish. That you could feel compassion for someone and still leave them. That moral choices often meant choosing between different kinds of harm. These stories multiplied across the country, across the world. Millions of people facing their own versions of the trolley problem. Making choices, carrying weight, living with consequences. And the philosophical debate continued. In academic journals, in classrooms, in late-night conversations between friends. People argued about utilitarianism and deontology, about the value of consent, about the role of intuition in moral judgment, about whether some acts were always wrong or whether circumstances could change everything. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the theories and frameworks, there was a deeper truth. A truth that Caleb Moore had learned at 73. That Dr. Rowan had learned through 15 years of grief. That Mara Vance had learned in a hospital hallway. That the lifeboat survivors had learned in the middle of the ocean. The truth was this: moral life is hard. It requires you to make choices you don't want to make. To live with outcomes you can't change. To carry weight you didn't ask for. And the only way through is to acknowledge all of that. To feel it. To let it change you. And then to keep going anyway. Not because you're certain you're right. Not because you found the perfect moral framework. Not because you can justify your choices philosophically. But because you're human. And being human means making choices, imperfect and incomplete as they are, and then living with them. 10 years after Rowan's class, there was a reunion. Former students gathered at a restaurant near campus. They had stayed loosely in touch through social media, but this was the first time they had all been together since graduation. They talked about their lives, their careers, their families. But eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to the class, to the trolley problem, to how it had changed them. David, now an emergency room physician, talked about a choice he had made the previous year. I had 2 patients. Car accident. Father and son. Both critical. I could only save one. I chose the son. He was younger. More likely to survive. Better chance at a full life. The father died. He paused, his voice tight. The son woke up and asked about his father. And I had to tell him that I let his dad die to save him. He said he wished I had chosen differently. Said he would rather have died than lose his father. And I realized that I had been thinking about statistics and survival rates. But I hadn't thought about what the survivors would have to live with. Do you regret it? Jessica asked. I don't know, David said honestly. How do you regret saving a life? But I also can't stop thinking about the father. About the son's grief. About whether maximizing survival time is actually the same as maximizing well-being. It's more complicated than I thought. Marcus, the social worker, shared his own story. I had a case where I had to choose between keeping a family together or protecting a child from neglect. The neglect wasn't severe. The parents loved their kids, but they were struggling. Poverty, mental illness, lack of support. I could have fought to keep the family intact, or I could have removed the children to ensure their immediate safety. I chose to remove them. It seemed like the safe choice, the right choice. But those kids were traumatized by being separated from their parents. They blamed me. They said I destroyed their family. And maybe they're right. Maybe I made the choice that protected me legally but harmed them emotionally. What would you do differently? Someone asked. I don't know, Marcus admitted. That's what haunts me. I still don't know what the right choice would have been. I just know that the choice I made had costs I didn't fully anticipate. Sarah, the journalist, talked about her work documenting refugee crises. I have to decide whose stories to tell, she said. I can't tell everyone's story. I have limited space, limited time, limited audience attention. So I choose the stories that I think will have the most impact. The most dramatic cases. The most sympathetic victims. But that means other stories don't get told. Other people remain invisible. Is that a trolley problem? Someone asked. It is, Sarah said. Because my choices about what to cover affect policy. Affect public opinion. Affect who gets help and who doesn't. I'm not pulling a lever on a train track. But I'm making choices that have real consequences for real people. And I can't cover everyone. So I choose. And I live with the fact that my choices create a hierarchy of suffering. James, the train engineer, had the story everyone wanted to hear. I had my moment, he said quietly. Not exactly like Caleb's, but close enough. The table went silent. There was a malfunction. Equipment failure. I had a train full of passengers heading toward a section of track that was out. If I continued, we would derail. Dozens would die. But I could emergency brake and redirect to a maintenance track. The problem was, there were workers on that maintenance track. 3 of them. No time to warn them. What did you do? David asked. I redirected, James said. I chose the 3 workers over the dozens of passengers. Same math as the classic problem. Same choice. The passengers survived. The workers died. He paused, his hands shaking slightly. And I carry it. Every day, I see their faces. I know their names. I met their families. I apologized even though everyone told me I made the right choice. But right doesn't erase the cost. Do you think about what Rowan taught us? Jessica asked. Every day, James said. He prepared me. Not for the choice itself. You can't prepare for that. But for living with it afterward. For accepting that I did something terrible even though it was necessary. For carrying the weight without letting it destroy me. The conversation continued late into the night. These former students, now professionals facing real trolley problems in their real lives, supporting each other, sharing their weight, acknowledging that moral life was exactly as complicated as Rowan had promised it would be. And in a small town in Vermont, Dr. Elias Rowan, now retired, sat in his study reading their messages. They had started a group chat years ago, and he occasionally checked in on their conversations. Watched them struggle with moral choices. Watched them question themselves. Watched them carry their weight with integrity. This was his legacy, not a philosophical framework, not a solution to the trolley problem, but a generation of people who understood that moral certainty was dangerous, that humility was essential, that weight was unavoidable, and that carrying it together made it bearable. He thought about his brother, about the 15 years he had spent running from grief, about the moment he had finally stopped running and let himself feel the full weight of what he had lost and what he had done, about how that acceptance had freed him to actually honor his brother's memory instead of just wallowing in guilt. He pulled out a letter he had written but never sent. It was addressed to his brother, to the version of his brother that lived only in memory now. I understand now, he had written. I understand that you didn't die because I was evil or because I didn't care. You died because I was human, fallible, capable of mistakes. And I've spent so long trying to be more than human, to be perfectly moral, to never make another mistake, that I forgot how to just be. I'm trying to do better now. Not trying to be perfect, just trying to be honest. Trying to acknowledge my capacity for both good and harm. Trying to teach others to do the same. And I think you would be proud of that. I think you would understand. I miss you. I will always miss you. But I'm learning to live with that missing instead of being consumed by it. I'm learning that grief doesn't dishonor your memory. Paralysis does. So I'm moving forward. Carrying you with me. Letting your death mean something by helping others avoid the kind of careless certainty that killed you. He folded the letter and put it back in his desk. Then he opened his laptop and started drafting the syllabus for a new course. Not ethics this time. Something different. A course about moral injury. About how people carry weight. About resilience in the face of impossible choices. Because that was what the world needed. Not more moral frameworks. Not more philosophical arguments. But practical wisdom about how to live ethically in a world that constantly demanded unethical choices. How to act with integrity when every option was flawed. How to carry weight without being crushed. Meanwhile, in a hospital in Boston, Dr. Mara Vance was sitting with a patient named Richard. He was dying of cancer, had maybe a week left, and he was struggling with guilt about a choice he had made 40 years earlier. I was a pilot in Vietnam, Richard said. We got a call about enemy troops gathering in a village. Command wanted us to bomb it, but I knew there were civilians there too. I argued, said we needed better intelligence. But my commanding officer overruled me, said the strategic value was too important. He paused, breathing heavily. I dropped the bombs, killed dozens of enemy fighters, also killed 17 civilians. Children, old people, families who had nothing to do with the war. And I've carried that for 40 years. What choice did you have? Mara asked gently. I could have refused. Could have been court-martialed. Could have stood by my principles. But I didn't. I followed orders. I told myself I was just doing my job. That the responsibility was command's, not mine. But I was the one who pressed the button. I was the one who killed those people. Mara sat with him in silence for a moment. Then she said, You know what I think? I think you're asking the wrong question. You're asking if you made the right choice. But maybe the right question is, what did you do with the weight you've carried? Richard looked at her, confused. You've carried this for 40 years, Mara continued. That's a long time. A heavy burden. But what did you do with it? Did you learn from it? Did you become a better person? Did you try to make amends in whatever way you could? Richard thought about it. I became a teacher, he said slowly. After the war, taught history, made sure my students understood the human cost of conflict, tried to prevent another generation from making the same mistakes. Does that count? I think so, Mara said. I think moral injury isn't about having done something wrong. It's about recognizing the weight of what you've done and choosing to carry it with purpose. You didn't hide from your choice. You didn't pretend it was okay. You carried it. You let it shape you. You used it to do good. That's all any of us can do. Richard started crying softly. I wanted absolution. Wanted to die feeling clean. But that's not going to happen, is it? No, Mara said honestly. You're going to die carrying that weight. But you don't have to die alone with it. And you don't have to die believing it made you a monster. You made a terrible choice in a terrible situation. You lived with the consequences. You tried to be better because of it. That's human. That's enough. Richard died 3 days later, peacefully, surrounded by family. And in his final moments, Mara hoped he felt some measure of peace. Not absolution, not forgiveness. Just peace with the fact that he had been human in an inhumane situation and had done his best to carry the weight with dignity. This was what she had learned in her years doing hospice work. That most people died carrying weight. Regrets. Mistakes. Terrible choices made in impossible circumstances. And her job wasn't to absolve them. It was to sit with them. To acknowledge their weight. To help them see that carrying weight didn't make them bad people. It made them human. Back at the restaurant, the reunion was winding down. The former students were preparing to leave, to return to their lives and their own trolley problems. But before they dispersed, Marcus raised his glass. To Dr. Rowan, he said, who taught us that moral certainty is dangerous. That weight is unavoidable, and that the only way through is together. Everyone raised their glasses. To Dr. Rowan, they went their separate ways, but they stayed connected, because they understood something that most people didn't. That moral life was lonely unless you found others who understood the weight you carried, who could sit with you in your uncertainty, who could acknowledge your struggles without trying to fix them or judge them. In the years that followed, they became a support network for each other. When David made a difficult medical decision, he called James. When Sarah covered a story that haunted her, she talked to Jessica. When Marcus faced an impossible case, he reached out to the group. They didn't offer solutions. They just offered presence. Understanding. The knowledge that someone else saw their struggle and respected it. This was community, not agreement, not shared answers, but shared willingness to sit with hard questions, to acknowledge complexity, to carry weight together. And slowly, gradually, they taught their own students, their own children, their own colleagues the same lessons Rowan had taught them. That moral certainty was dangerous. That weight was real. That sitting with questions was more important than having answers. The trolley problem continued to be taught in philosophy classes around the world. Professors presented it. Students debated it. Arguments were made for utilitarian and deontological approaches. Papers were written. Theories were proposed. But the real lesson, the one that mattered, wasn't in the academic journals. It was in the lives of people like Caleb and Rowan and Mara and the lifeboat survivors and all the ordinary people facing extraordinary moral choices. The lesson was simple. Moral life is hard. Weight is real. Carry it with integrity. Don't carry it alone. 10 years after his retirement, Dr. Rowan received an invitation to give a TED Talk. The topic was moral decision-making. He almost declined. He had said everything he needed to say in decades of teaching. What more could he add? But then he thought about reach, about the thousands of people who might hear his message, about the potential to spread the lessons he had spent his career teaching. So he accepted. He stood on the red circle, looking out at the audience, and began with a story. Not the trolley problem, not the lifeboat, but his own story. His brother, the accident, the 15 years of running from grief. I teach ethics, he said, not because I'm good at being ethical, but because I'm good at failing ethically. I know what it feels like to make a terrible choice, to live with consequences you can't undo, to carry weight that never fully lifts. And I've learned that this experience, this moral injury, is universal. He paused, letting that sink in. We all face trolley problems. Not the literal kind, usually, but moral dilemmas where every option is flawed, where we have to choose between different kinds of harm, where we can't avoid hurting someone no matter what we do. And when those moments come, we need tools. Not answers, but tools. The first tool is awareness, he continued. Recognize that you're in a trolley problem, that there is no clean choice, that certainty is probably wrong. This awareness doesn't solve the problem, but it changes how you approach it. The second tool is humility. Accept that you might be wrong, that your framework might be insufficient, that the person you're arguing with might see something you don't. Hold your moral convictions firmly, but not rigidly. The third tool is responsibility. Don't hide behind policy or procedure or the fact that you were just following orders. Own your choices. Acknowledge their weight. Live with their consequences. This is terrifying, but it's the only path to integrity. The fourth tool is community. Find people who understand the weight you carry, who can sit with you in your uncertainty, who won't try to fix you or absolve you, but will simply be present for your struggle. We can't carry moral weight alone. We need each other. And the final tool is forgiveness. Not of others necessarily, though that matters too, but of yourself. Recognize that you're human, that humans make mistakes, that moral perfection is impossible, and that striving for it is less important than learning to live with your imperfections. The talk went on for 18 minutes. Rowan told stories, offered frameworks, challenged assumptions, and when he finished, the audience sat in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, but contemplative silence. The silence of people who had been confronted with something true. The video went viral. Millions of views. Comments from people all over the world sharing their own trolley problems, their own moral injuries, their own struggles with impossible choices. And in those comments, community formed. People found each other, supported each other, carried their weight together. This was the real answer to the trolley problem. Not a philosophical solution, not a moral framework, but a recognition that we're all in this together, that we all face impossible choices, that we all carry weight, and that the only way through is with compassion. For others, yes, but also for ourselves. Years passed. Caleb's scholarship continued, funded by an endowment he had left. Thomas Brennan's name lived on. The 5 men he had saved all eventually died, as everyone does, but their families remained. Their grandchildren grew up knowing the story, knowing that their existence was tied to a terrible choice made decades ago, carrying that knowledge with gratitude and solemnity. The lifeboat survivors all eventually died too, some earlier than others, some never recovering from what they had done, others finding ways to move forward, but all of them carrying Owen Hale with them until the end. His name tattooed on their bodies, his memory honored in their choices, his death never forgotten or minimized. Dr. Mara Vance continued her hospice work until she was too old to continue. Then she volunteered, sat with dying people, listened to their regrets, helped them find peace not through absolution, but through acceptance. She died at 87, surrounded by former patients' families who credited her with giving their loved ones dignity in death. And Dr. Elias Rowan taught until he physically couldn't anymore. Then he wrote, published memoirs, created online courses, spread his message as far as he could. He died at 79, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of former students. Each of them stood up and shared a story, a moment when his teaching had mattered, a choice they had made differently because of him, a weight they had learned to carry with integrity. It was the most honest funeral anyone had attended. No pretending Rowan had been perfect, no minimizing his flaws or struggles, just acknowledgement of a man who had failed, learned from his failure, and spent his life helping others do the same. His brother's name was mentioned. The accident was acknowledged. And instead of being a shameful secret, it was recognized as the foundation of everything Rowan had accomplished. His greatest failure had become his greatest gift to the world. This was the final lesson. That moral injury, when carried with integrity, could become moral wisdom. That weight, when shared, could become strength. That failure, when acknowledged, could become teaching. The trolley problem didn't have a solution. It never would, because it wasn't really about trains or tracks or switches. It was about being human in a world that demanded more than humans could give. It was about making choices when every option hurt. It was about living with consequences we never wanted to create. But here's what generations of people had learned through facing their own trolley problems. You don't need a solution. You just need awareness, humility, responsibility, community, and forgiveness. You need to know that you're going to face impossible choices, that you're going to fail sometimes, that you're going to carry weight, and that this is okay. This is human. This is what it means to be alive in a morally complex world. You need to approach those choices with humility, recognizing you might be wrong, listening to others, holding your convictions firmly but not rigidly, being willing to change your mind when presented with new information. You need to take responsibility for your choices, not hiding behind excuses or frameworks or the fact that you were in an impossible situation. Owning the choice, living with its consequences, acknowledging its weight. You need community, people who understand, who won't judge you or try to fix you but will sit with you in your struggle, who will remind you that you're not alone, that everyone carries weight, that sharing it makes it bearable. And you need forgiveness, the kind that doesn't erase what happened or pretend it was okay, but the kind that acknowledges you're human, that humans fail, that moral perfection is impossible, and that striving for integrity is more important than achieving perfection. These weren't solutions to the trolley problem, but they were ways to live with it, ways to make impossible choices and then keep going, ways to carry weight without being crushed. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask. Not for perfect moral clarity, not for easy answers, not for choices without consequences, but for the tools to navigate moral complexity with integrity, for the wisdom to sit with hard questions, for the courage to carry weight, for the grace to forgive ourselves and others for being human. The story of the train that never stopped, the boat that went adrift, the bridge over the gorge, the classroom that asked impossible questions. All of these stories were really the same story. The story of humans facing their limitations, their mortality, their capacity for both good and harm, and learning to live with all of it. Caleb standing at the switch, the survivors in the boat, Mara in the ER, Rowan at the wheel, Richard in the cockpit. Every person facing their moment of impossible choice. Every person making their best guess. Every person living with the consequences. This was the human condition. Not heroic, not villainous, just human, flawed and trying, failing and learning, hurting and healing, carrying weight and finding ways to move forward despite it. And the remarkable thing was that despite all the weight, despite all the impossible choices, despite all the moral injury and struggle and failure, humans kept going, kept trying, kept caring, kept showing up for each other, kept building communities that shared weight, kept teaching each other how to carry it with dignity. This was hope, not the kind that pretended everything would be okay, not the kind that denied the weight or minimized the struggle, but the kind that acknowledged how hard it was and chose to keep going anyway. The kind that said yes. Moral life is complicated and painful and full of impossible choices, and we're going to face it together anyway. This was love. Not the romantic kind necessarily, though that too, but the deep, fundamental love that recognized shared humanity, that saw someone struggling with weight and said, I see you. I understand. You're not alone. The love that didn't try to fix or solve, but simply bore witness. The love that said, your struggle matters. Your weight is real, and I will sit with you in it. This was meaning, not handed down from authority or discovered through philosophy, but created through the daily act of facing moral complexity with integrity, created through the choice to carry weight instead of running from it, created through community and responsibility and the refusal to let moral injury destroy you. And this, finally, was the answer to the question that had haunted Caleb and Rowan and all the others. Not what should I do, but how should I live with what I've done? The answer was, with awareness, with humility, with responsibility, with community, with forgiveness, with the understanding that you're human, and being human means carrying weight, and carrying weight means you're alive and connected and part of the beautiful, terrible, complicated tapestry of moral life. In a small apartment in Seattle, a young woman named Emma was preparing to teach her first ethics class. She was nervous. She had studied philosophy for years, read all the theories, understood the frameworks. But she also knew, having taken Rowan's course a decade earlier, that none of that mattered as much as her own moral failures. She thought about her trolley problem, the time she had stayed silent while a friend was being bullied because speaking up would have made her a target too, the time she had reported a colleague for misconduct and watched their career end, the time she had chosen her own safety over someone else's well-being, the time she had chosen someone else's well-being over her own safety. All those moments where there was no right answer, where every choice hurt, where she had to make her best guess and then live with it forever. She decided to start her first class the way Rowan had taught her, with a story, Not the trolley problem. Her own story. Her own moral failure. Her own weight. "I'm going to tell you about the worst thing I ever did," she began, looking out at her students. Young faces full of confidence and certainty, and the beautiful ignorance of people who hadn't yet faced their own trolley problems. "I had a friend who was being abused," she said. "I knew about it. She told me in confidence. Asked me not to tell anyone. I promised I wouldn't. And I kept that promise for 2 years while the abuse continued. Because I had given my word. Because she had asked me to stay silent. Because I was following what I thought was a moral principle about keeping promises and respecting autonomy." She paused. "Eventually, I broke my promise. I told someone. Got her help. She was furious with me. Said I had betrayed her trust. Ended our friendship. But she also got away from her abuser. She also got therapy. She also survived. So here's my question for you," Emma continued. "Did I do the right thing? I broke a promise. I violated her autonomy. I hurt our friendship. But I also potentially saved her life. There's no formula for this. No framework that makes it clean. I just made a choice. And I live with it. And I question it. And I'll never know for sure if I was right." The students looked uncomfortable. This wasn't what they had expected from an ethics course. They had expected theory, debate, abstract principles, not their professor's personal moral failures. "This is what I want you to understand," Emma said. "Ethics isn't about getting the right answer on a test. It's about making choices when every option is flawed. It's about living with the consequences of those choices. It's about carrying weight with integrity. And it's about recognizing that you're going to fail. You're going to make choices you regret. You're going to hurt people while trying to help them. You're going to help people while hurting others. And you're going to have to live with all of it." She projected a simple diagram on the screen. A train track splitting into 2 paths. 5 people on one track. 1 person on the other. "Let's start with the trolley problem," she said. "Not to solve it, but to understand why it can't be solved. And to learn how to live with that impossibility." The semester unfolded. Students went through the same progression Emma had gone through. Certainty to confusion to something like wisdom. They argued. They struggled. They questioned everything they thought they knew. And slowly, they began to understand. That moral life was complicated. That weight was real. That community mattered. That forgiveness was essential. That being human meant making impossible choices and then carrying them with dignity. This teaching continued. Generation after generation. Students becoming teachers. Teaching their own students. Spreading the lesson that had started with Caleb at a train switch and continued through Rowan's classroom and Mara's hospital and Emma's first lecture. The lesson wasn't a solution. It was a practice. A way of being in the world. A commitment to facing moral complexity with integrity rather than certainty. A recognition that weight was unavoidable but didn't have to be carried alone. And somewhere, in the grand accounting of human history, this mattered. Not because it solved the trolley problem, but because it changed how people approached the trolley problem. It made them more thoughtful, more humble, more compassionate, more willing to sit with hard questions instead of rushing to easy answers. It prevented some atrocities. The kind that happened when people were too certain they were right. The kind that happened when moral frameworks became more important than human dignity. The kind that happened when outcomes were valued more than process. It didn't prevent all harm. Nothing could. But it reduced some harm, created some good, made some spaces safer, made some choices better, made some people more capable of carrying weight with integrity. And in a world full of trolley problems, where impossible choices were unavoidable, that was something. That was enough. That was all anyone could hope for. The line we wouldn't cross wasn't a line after all. It was a threshold, a space we entered reluctantly, carrying all our contradictions with us. A space where outcomes and principles collided, where math and morality battled, where certainty died and something more honest was born. We crossed that threshold every time we faced an impossible choice. Every time we had to decide between different kinds of harm. Every time we realized there was no clean answer, no perfect solution, no way forward that didn't hurt someone. And what we found on the other side wasn't clarity. It was community. Other people who had crossed the same threshold. Who carried their own weight, who understood, who could sit with us in our uncertainty without trying to fix it or judge it. This was the real answer to the trolley problem. Not a philosophical framework, not a moral calculation, but the recognition that we're all standing at that switch. We're all in that boat. We're all making impossible choices. And the only way through is together, with awareness of what we're doing, with humility about whether we're right, with responsibility for the consequences, with community to share the weight, and with forgiveness for ourselves and others for being human in an inhuman situation. So when you face your trolley problem, because you will, know this, you're not alone. Countless others have stood where you're standing, have struggled with what you're struggling with, have made choices and lived with them, and found ways to keep going despite the weight. Know that there might not be a right answer, that you might question your choice forever, that you might carry weight for the rest of your life. And know that this is okay. This is human. This is what it means to take moral life seriously. Don't hide behind certainty. Don't pretend your framework gives you permission to avoid feeling the weight of your choice. Don't distance yourself from the consequences with logic or math or principles. Feel it, all of it. The horror and necessity of what you're doing. The cost and benefit. The harm and help. And then make your choice anyway. Not because you're certain it's right, but because paralysis is also a choice, and usually a worse one. Make your choice knowing you might be wrong, knowing you'll question it, knowing you'll carry it. But make it. And after you make it, live with it. Don't run from the consequences. Don't hide from the weight. Own it. Acknowledge it. Let it change you. Let it make you more thoughtful, more humble, more compassionate. Let it teach you about the complexity of moral life. Find your community, the people who understand, who carry their own weight, who can sit with you in your struggle without trying to fix you. Share your story. Listen to theirs. Bear witness to each other's weight. Remind each other that you're human, that humans fail, that failure doesn't make you a monster. And forgive yourself. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Recognize that you did your best with the information you had, that you're not omniscient, that moral perfection is impossible, that striving for integrity is more important than achieving perfection. This is how you live with the trolley problem. This is how you carry weight. This is how you remain human in a world that constantly demands impossible choices. And maybe, just maybe, by living this way, by facing moral complexity with integrity rather than certainty, by carrying weight together rather than alone, by forgiving ourselves and others for being human, we create a world that's slightly better, slightly kinder, slightly more honest about what we're asking of each other. We don't solve the trolley problem, but we learn to live with it. And in learning to live with it, we become more capable of the kind of moral courage that actually matters. Not the courage to make hard choices, but the courage to acknowledge the cost of those choices, to carry the weight, to remain human despite the inhumanity of the situations we face. This was Caleb's legacy, standing at that switch for 42 years, neither proud nor ashamed, just human, carrying Thomas with him, honoring the 5 men he saved and the 1 man he killed, never pretending it was simple, never claiming moral victory, just carrying the weight with dignity until the day he died. This was Rowan's legacy, turning his greatest failure into his greatest gift, teaching thousands of students that certainty was dangerous and humility was essential, creating a generation of people who approached moral choices with awareness of their complexity, who carried weight without being crushed by it, who found community in shared struggle. This was Mara's legacy, learning that some weights were too heavy to carry alone, finding a different way to serve, sitting with dying people in their moral reckoning, helping them find peace not through absolution but through acceptance, showing that there were many ways to be good, and sometimes the most important thing was knowing your limits. This was the legacy of the lifeboat survivors, living with what they had done, never hiding from it, never claiming it was okay, just carrying it. Some carried it better than others. Some were crushed by it. But all of them bore witness to the terrible truth that survival sometimes costs more than death. That living with your choices can be harder than dying from them. That moral injury is real and lasting and deserves to be acknowledged. And this became the legacy of everyone who faced their trolley problem with integrity, who made impossible choices and then lived with them honestly, who shared their weight instead of hiding it, who taught others that moral complexity was real and unavoidable and bearable. The story that started with a train switch in 1982 continued through classrooms and hospitals and boats and courtrooms and ordinary lives facing extraordinary moments. It continued because the trolley problem wasn't really about trains. It was about being human. And as long as humans existed, the problem would exist. The weight would exist. The need to make impossible choices would exist. But so would community. So would compassion. So would the capacity to carry weight together. So would the wisdom that came from acknowledging moral complexity instead of denying it. So would the courage to keep going despite the weight. So would the grace to forgive ourselves for being human. This was the line we wouldn't cross. Or rather, it was the threshold we learned to cross with integrity. The space where our moral frameworks failed and our humanity remained. The moment when we had to choose between terrible options and then live with whichever terrible option we chose. We crossed that threshold together, supporting each other, sharing our stories, acknowledging our weight, reminding each other that we were human, that being human meant failing, that failing meant learning, that learning meant growing, that growing meant becoming more capable of carrying weight with dignity. And in the end, that was all we could hope for. Not moral perfection, not clean answers, not choices without consequences, just the capacity to face moral complexity honestly, to carry weight without being crushed, to remain human in situations that demanded inhumanity, to keep going despite the impossibility of it all. So if you're standing at a switch right now, facing your own trolley problem, know this: whatever you choose, you'll question it. Whatever you do, it will cost you. Whatever path you take, you'll carry weight. This is unavoidable. This is the price of moral consciousness. This is what it means to be human. But you don't have to carry it alone. There are others who understand, who have stood where you're standing, who have chosen and questioned and carried. Find them, share with them, learn from them, build community with them, and know that your struggle matters. Your weight is real. Your choice, whatever it is, deserves to be acknowledged for the impossible thing it is. You're not a monster for facing a trolley problem. You're human. And being human in a world full of trolley problems is the hardest, most important thing anyone can do. This is not a satisfying ending. There's no resolution, no answer, no way to close the book on the trolley problem and move on feeling good about having solved it. Because it can't be solved. It can only be lived with. But living with it, carrying the weight, facing the complexity, maintaining your humanity despite the impossibility of it all, that's everything. That's the whole point. Not to solve the problem, but to remain human while facing it. Not to eliminate the weight, but to carry it with dignity. Not to find easy answers, but to sit with hard questions and make choices anyway. This is what Caleb learned, what Rowan taught, what Mara discovered, what the lifeboat survivors lived with, what Emma is now teaching her own students, what you will learn when you face your own trolley problem. The line we wouldn't cross is the line between acknowledging complexity and denying it, between carrying weight and running from it, between remaining human and becoming monstrous, between moral courage and moral certainty. We cross into terrible choices, into impossible situations, into moments where everything hurts. But we cross with awareness, with humility, with responsibility, with community, with forgiveness, and we come out the other side changed, scarred, carrying weight, but still human, still capable of love and compassion and connection, still able to face the next impossible choice with integrity. This is the story of the line we wouldn't cross, but also the story of all the lines we did cross, all the impossible choices we made, all the weight we carried, all the ways we remained human despite everything that tried to make us less than human. It's a story without an ending because the trolley problem never ends. New generations face it, new contexts present it, new impossible choices demand responses. But each generation learns from the last, carries the wisdom forward, adds their own stories to the collective understanding of what it means to face moral complexity with integrity. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. Not solutions, but wisdom. Not answers, but community. Not clarity, but honesty. Not perfection, but humanity. The train is still on the tracks. The boat is still drifting. The switch is still waiting. And we're still standing there, making our choices, carrying our weight, remaining human despite it all. If you've made it this far in this story, if you've sat with these impossible questions, if you felt the weight of moral complexity, then you understand. You understand that the trolley problem isn't just a thought experiment. It's life. It's what we face every time we have to choose between different kinds of harm. Every time we have to decide what we owe each other. Every time we have to weigh outcomes against principles, consequences against dignity, math against humanity. And understanding that is the first step, not toward solving the problem, but toward living with it, toward carrying the weight, toward remaining human in a world that constantly demands impossible choices. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with these questions. Thank you for acknowledging that moral life is complicated and weight is real and community matters. If this story has resonated with you, if it's made you think about the choices you've made or the weight you carry or the community you need, then do something about it. Share your story. Find others who understand. Build community around shared struggle. Teach what you've learned. Carry your weight with dignity. Remain human despite everything. And if you're facing your own trolley problem right now, know that countless others have stood where you're standing, have struggled with what you're struggling with, have made choices and lived with them and found ways to keep going. You're not alone. Your weight is real. Your struggle matters. And there are people who will sit with you in it without trying to fix you or judge you. This is how we survive moral complexity. Together, with awareness and humility and responsibility and community and forgiveness. This is how we remain human. This is how we carry the weight. This is how we cross the line we thought we wouldn't cross and come out the other side still ourselves. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on your own moral journey. Think about the impossible choices you've faced, the weight you carry, the lines you've crossed or refused to cross. And then, if you found value in this story, if it helped you understand your own struggle better, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment about your own trolley problem, your own weight, your own journey. Build community. Share the burden. Remind each other that you're human, because that's what this is all about. Not solving the trolley problem, but creating spaces where we can acknowledge its existence, where we can share our weight, where we can remain human together despite the impossibility of it all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to sit with hard questions. And remember, whatever choice you're facing, whatever weight you're carrying, whatever line you're trying to figure out whether to cross, you're not alone. Others have been there. Others understand. And together, we can carry what individually would crush us. Now rest, think, reflect, and know that your moral struggle, your weight, your humanity, all of it matters. All of it is seen. All of it is honored. You are human in a world full of trolley problems, and that is enough. That is everything.